We have long puzzled over what the Stone Age monuments of the British Isles were built for. Astronomical observatories, places of worship, perhaps even sites of ritual sacrifice. Now there's a radical new theory, and it's one that may change our understanding of the Stone Age. It's all about sound.
One of the most important things to people in the Neolithic would have been sound. They would have been far more aware of sounds in their environment. If they're hunting, the crack of a twig, the little snort of an animal would have been important in the past.
Archaeologists have found Neolithic sites that play strange tricks with sound, sometimes amplifying it, sometimes distorting it, and sometimes even inducing in the listener strange physical sensations. These effects may be coincidence, but evidence is mounting to show these effects were deliberately built into the design of these monuments.
We're seeing here the sophistication in acoustics that we already is apparent to us in the sophistication in the architecture of the building of the structure, its astronomical alignment. It's all of a piece.
Could it be that 5,000 years ago, our ancestors had a sophisticated knowledge of acoustics? The story started 7 years ago, when a young research student took a tourist trip to a Stone Age circle in northern Scotland.
When I first visited the circle, what struck me was that as I moved across this very central region of the monument, I heard sounds made by other visitors, particularly in the area of the large recumbent slab being reflected across the circle. I heard an increase in volume, it became a fuller sound, and there also seemed to be reflections coming off the other stones in the circle. And then, as I continued moving across the site, I heard those sounds suddenly decrease. They dropped away. The sounds no longer behaved in that extraordinary way. And that really set me thinking, because I thought, well, if I'm finding these sounds extraordinary, how would people in prehistory have understood them, the people who used this site originally?
For the moment, Watson's idea was just that, an idea. He needed help to measure the effects scientifically.
When Aaron came to me, I was slightly bemused as to why somebody from archaeology was coming across to cybernetics. But I think within the university, cybernetics has a bit of a reputation for being the weirdos, the oddballs. And if there's any strange request, then it tends to get, sort of dumped on cybernetics. Initially, I was quite surprised to hear there was any acoustic effect at all. Like a great many stone circles, it consists of stones which are quite widely spaced. There's far more gap than there is stone, and so you'd expect maybe to get a little echo off of each stone, but nothing that you'd really be able to hear. And he was saying that these effects were quite striking, so I was quite intrigued to find out what was going on.
Simply by clapping my hands, it's possible to hear sounds being reflected off the different stones, off the recumbent, and it becomes most animated when you're moving. As I move into the alcove, the way in which sound is being reflected off all of the other stones in the circle becomes much more evident. You hear very slight reverberations from each of the monoliths in turn.
I suggested a set of equipment for him to take up there in order to test this so that we could measure it and find out at any particular frequency what the structure is actually doing to the sound.
When he returned to Scotland, Watson placed one sound generator next to the recumbent or reclining stone, another generator in open ground, then compared results. In the stone circle, the recumbent stone amplified the sound dramatically.
This is a plot of the movement of sound at Easter Alcorthes. On the left, we have measurements in an open field. The dark greys represent the higher intensities of sound, and how our equipment measured its decay across the landscape. In almost complete contrast on the right are the measurements we took at Easter Alhorthes itself. And this is the diameter of the circle here with the recumbent block at the top. And this is where we placed our sound source. And we can see an almost total difference as higher sound intensities are dramatically boosted out across the center of the circle.
There was really quite significant sort of change in sound thanks to the circle. This large recumbent stone pretty much blocked the sound from behind, but in front it was beaming it out into the stone circle.
20 feet from the recumbent stone, the sound was 3 times louder than in open ground. Watson and Keating claimed to have unearthed a sort of Stone Age loudspeaker. But they were not the only ones to think Stone Age sites were built with sound in mind. Unknown to them, at the same time, an Anglo-American team had stumbled upon the idea too. This is Wayland's Smithy, a burial chamber in Berkshire dating from around 3000 BC.
Well, this was the first site that we acoustically tested, and we set up our acoustic equipment here, and we could tell from our voices and from humming and from clapping that there was a resonance very clearly, quite strong resonant quality in here.
At a particular frequency, the chamber resonated, amplifying and increasing the sound of his voice. This resonance is caused by something called a standing wave.
A standing wave is where you get, at a certain frequency, the sound bounces off the walls and comes back and adds with the original sound. And so you get much more intensity than you would have got otherwise.
When the sound bounces from the walls, it is reflected back and forth in perfect synchrony, amplifying sound from the original source.
Standing waves exist not only in acoustic waves, but in all sorts of physical structures.
4 months after it was opened, winds sent the bridge into a rhythmic dance of death. It literally shook itself to pieces.
And there's a very famous case of the Tacona Narrows Bridge, where the wind blew down the valley, and at just the right wind speed, it excited the natural standing wave frequency of the bridge.
Here it goes.
Standing waves caused the tomb at Wayland's Smithy to resonate. But Devereux wanted to find out at what frequency this happened.
We scanned through the frequencies and we found that the chamber over here had a resonant frequency of 112 hertz, and the chamber on this side had a frequency of 95 hertz.
The finding surprised him. This frequency is at the bottom end of the range of the male baritone.
We were immediately intrigued and alerted, and we wondered if there'd be any other chambers that would resonate in that frequency.
New Grange is the greatest passage grave of the Stone Age. A small burial chamber, 17 feet long and 20 feet high, set deep within a much larger structure, linked by a 60-foot tunnel or passage to the outside world. Standing near the River Boyne in Central Ireland, it's over 5,000 years old, older than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Paul Devereux and his colleague, Princeton scientist Bob Jahn, wondered if it would also resonate to the sound of the male voice.
We placed the sound source at the center of the main chamber, and sure enough, nice clear response at pretty much the same frequency. So, you know, we felt at that point we were on to something.
New Grange resonated at 110 hertz, within the same frequency band as Wayland's smithy. But if this was more than luck, then they needed to examine other sites. They chose 4 other chambered buildings, each selected entirely at random, 2 in Ireland, 2 others in Cornwall.
They were drastically different. Some of them were round, some of them were rectangular, some of them had ceilings, some of them didn't have ceilings. But when we repeated this experiment over and over again in these 6 cavities, the remarkable thing was that we found virtually the same resonant behavior.
Could this common resonance have been deliberately built into these structures? For Professor Jahn, the answer was clear.
It was almost as if this was somehow in their building guide to design these things, to construct these things, to have that common resonant frequency. This was not a trivial accomplishment, because with cavities that are that complex, the possibilities for standing wave patterns are so proliferate that to get the ones that all have the common frequency and yet are based in such a disparate geometrical set of configurations was really a remarkable achievement.
It could have been chance. All buildings resonate at some frequency, and 6 sites are a very small sample. But Jahn had noticed something else.
In many cases, we saw evidence that the cavities had actually been retrofit with baffle stones, some of the geometries altered slightly. They were tuning the cavity, as it were, by empirical placement of the baffles and openings and changes in the geometry until they got it.
The evidence was hard to dismiss. The structures had been constantly altered to get the acoustics right. Stonehenge was built around 2000 years BC, at least 1,000 years later than New Grange. So, if Neolithic builders really did know how to manipulate sound, might evidence be found here too?
One of the things we noticed when we first came to Stonehenge was the difference between the inside surface and the outside surface of the stones. The inside surface here has been considerably worked, and it's actually smooth and it's a concave surface, and we can see that on these stones which are part of the outer circle. If we look at the outside surface of the stones, we can see that this is not being worked. It's still the natural, unfinished surface, and we can see it's irregular, it's convex. And the difference that this would cause acoustically is that this smooth, concave surface would tend to reflect and focus the sound back into the center of the ring, whereas the outside surface would have scattered the sound.
There is no other explanation for why the stones were shaped this way, unless it was to enhance the effects of sound.
It's a very strong argument that says that they did this for acoustic reasons. And the reason for that is that we can actually see these stones sort of in profile, but you have to remember that that's because part of Stonehenge has fallen down. And when the outside circle was complete, you would never have been able to see the stones edge on. And so this wasn't really a visual effect. From the center of the circle, you can't see that inside surface is concave. And so really, if it wasn't a visual effect, that only really leaves an acoustic effect that they were trying to produce.
If Stone Age people were trying to produce an acoustic effect, the question is, why? Perhaps an answer lay in passage graves like New Grange. Until now, Archaeologists had thought of these graves simply as resting places for the dead.
It was clearly related to the human voice interior. Yet these places are supposed to be places for the silent dead. So the immediate implication of the finding was that there had to have been ritual going on here as well. So suddenly, it was almost as if we were hearing the voices from the Stone Age.
It appears from the design of passage graves and the shaping of stones at Stonehenge that Neolithic people may have been creating places for the human voice. Now, new findings from France suggest knowledge of sound might be many thousands of years older still. The Stone Age monuments that dot the British Isles have led a growing number of archaeologists to think Neolithic people had an understanding of the science of acoustics. But now some researchers think a rudimentary knowledge of sound predates even the Stone Age. Cave art specialist Steve Waller was holidaying in France when he visited Neo in the Pyrenees to look at paintings made by hunter-gatherers 13,000 years ago.
I decided that it would be interesting to visit some of these prehistoric caves. And at the entrance of one of them, I was standing there thinking, if I was a caveman, why would I come here? Why would I go deep in the caves to draw those paintings? And I shouted to my wife, "Hey, Pat!" And my voice came back out of the cave, "Hey, Pat!" And it almost knocked me over because I realized they didn't know that echoes are simply sound waves propagating and reflecting back. They thought that echoes were due to spirits.
At Neo, the paintings are hidden deep within the cave, up to 1 mile from the entrance.
The subterranean world was the world of the spirits. That's where the dead went, or that's where the ancestors lived, and the gods, and the spirits. So that means that going deep inside the caves was a deliberate move to go into the supernatural world. It was, literally speaking, a supernatural journey.
Steve Waller wanted to know, could sound explain why these people journeyed so far into the caves? Was there any connection between the location of the paintings and the acoustics of the caves? He began to measure the strength and timings of echoes in each cave and charted the location of every painting. His tests came up with an astonishing answer.
After testing more than 100 rock art locations on 3 continents, I found that there's a very good correlation between the places with the best acoustics and where the rock art's located.
The cave walls with poor or faint echoes tended to be unpainted. The surfaces with the strongest and most powerful echoes were the ones that had been painted on.
The prehistoric artists were specifically seeking out locations that had the best acoustics and choosing those places to make the art.
If Waller is right, then it was clearly important for the artists of Neo to locate their paintings in the best place for sound. But that doesn't explain why they did it. One theory suggests a clue can be found in how some of the paintings were made.
A number of the black images that we see weren't painted on with a brush. They were blown on through long bones of animals. Archaeologists have found long bones with pigment inside them.
Research on these pigments suggests such methods may have had a dramatic effect on the painter.
When artists were coming into contact with that pigment, which was made up of manganese oxide, they would have experienced manganese poisoning.
Scientists know that one of the symptoms of manganese poisoning is hallucination.
While making these images, while blowing the pigment onto the wall to make some of these images, these people would have been entering an altered state of consciousness. They would have been seeing hallucinations.
Thomas Dowson believes these hallucinations would be interpreted as journeys into the spirit world. And in this state, sound would have played a vital part.
We know when people are going into an altered state of consciousness, they hallucinate on all 5 senses. So certainly sound would have been a part of their experiences in the spirit world.
The cave would be a place where art, worship, visions of the spirit world and sound combined to provide a religious experience.
If you look at just the physical space that we're in, it is quite possible that you can have a number of people involved in some sort of ritual in front of this panel. The way in which one's voice reverberates around this chamber today, almost certainly sounds would have been made by that group of people, and it would have been part of that ritual.
"8,000 years later, in the Stone Age, new findings from the Orkney Islands suggest Neolithic people also experienced unusual physical sensations.
Orkney may be remote from the centres of population in modern Britain, but in the Neolithic there seems to have been a major centre of possibly population and certainly a very influential area.
No evidence of manganese poisoning has been found in Orkney. Beneath this mound lies the 5,000-year-old passage grave of Mace Howe. In the Stone Age, it was a place where sound played strange tricks.
An example that we ourselves have personally experienced with my friend Simon O'Dwyer, he played a Bronze Age horn in the chamber, and 4 of us in there all felt the same sensation, which was an intensification of the sound plus a vibration coming up through the floor of the structure, through our limbs and into our guts, basically, so that you felt an excitement of your whole body without any kind of change in the sound that you could pick up on a tape recorder or anything. So this is not just simply an acoustic phenomenon, it's a whole body phenomenon. You can even hear through your body.
As at New Grange in Ireland, archaeologists now believe that here Stone Age people buried their dead and took part in religious rituals. And when they sang or played instruments, the tomb's natural resonance may have caused unusual, disorientating sensations.
It tends to produce effects like dizziness or giddiness, and they would get a feeling of being very uneasy. You feel this very strange effect. You feel nauseous or you feel like you're going to fall over, and you've no idea. What do you think's going on?
David Keating wanted to find out why the resonance of Mace Howe caused these effects. The design of the tomb gave him an idea.
I could see that there was a large chamber, and leading onto the chamber was this long, narrow passage. And immediately I looked at it and I thought, well, that looks like a Helmholtz resonator. And of course, Aaron's like, what's a Helmholtz resonator? And I said, well, this is the effect that this chap, Mr. Helmholtz, discovered, which is the effect you get when you blow across the neck of a bottle. You've got a section here which acts as a passage, and then there's a section which acts as the sort of chamber. And if I blow here, As you can see, it's very easy to get a note out there, quite a low frequency from this bottle. The phenomena of blowing across a bottle led us to believe that perhaps the wind blowing across the entrance of Maze Howe could set this off. The other possible source is the thunder of a big storm.
Like a gigantic bottle, storms blowing across the entrance might have activated Helmholtz resonance. But that didn't explain why people inside were suffering from dizziness or feelings of unease. The answer lay in the low level of sound at which Helmholtz resonance was activated.
We came out with a frequency of 2 hertz. Now that's well below the limit of audibility. You know, the lowest frequency that humans can hear is about 20 hertz. And so it's infrasound.
This man is being subjected to a special sort of sound, infrasound. And as the level of infrasound increases, his reaction time slows considerably.
Infrasound cannot be heard, but its effects can be felt.
Different parts of the body resonate at different frequencies. You find that just below 20 hertz, just at the edge of audibility, things like your eyeballs will vibrate, so you start to get blurred vision.
In the 1960s, scientists began to realize how dangerous infrasound was to the driver.
The accidents that do occur are quite often due to single cars for no apparent reason crossing the central reservation.
If you come a bit lower down, you find that your stomach vibrates, and so obviously you're going to make someone feel pretty unwell because you're shaking the stomach around. The other thing is there are natural brain patterns that happen at these sort of frequencies.
Some of the surviving drivers have said that they were aware that they were driving into the oncoming traffic and that it didn't seem to matter.
The low frequency, around about 2 hertz, associated with calmness, or not quite being asleep, but, you know, a sort of, your body is in a very rested state, but your mind is still sort of active.
And all these symptoms can add up to a condition which is very similar to drunkenness. And symptoms like that in a car driver, whatever the cause, can be pretty devastating.
Because Maze Howe resonated to an infrasonic frequency, those inside might feel dizzy, disorientated, or even experience altered states of consciousness. If this happened during a religious ritual, it might have been interpreted as a journey into the spirit world. But that posed another question. Could Stone Age people have deliberately induced these effects themselves? Drums have been found at several Stone Age sites like Maze Howe, and drums can create infrasound.
The people within Maze Howe would hear the drum beat, the dum, 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 but they'd be completely unaware that there was a very, very loud infrasonic frequency there. It could be a very high level of sound, and they'd be totally unaware that it was even there.
The team set up an experiment to test the effects of drumming in Maze Howe. As Aaron Watson beat the drum, something strange happened to David Keating.
I began to experience a sort of falling asleep effect, and my head became heavy, and I started to nod down. Then I noticed I got the kind of twitches that you get when you're falling asleep, and my arms started to go like this. I realised that what was odd was I was kind of consciously experiencing all of these effects. My body had sort of just relaxed, and yet I was still very much with it. I'd experienced this bizarre situation where my body seemed to have fallen asleep whilst my brain stayed wide awake.
It seems likely that some Stone Age people were using sound in complex ways. But who were these people? And what were they using it for? Knew how to manipulate sound. Now archaeologists wanted to know who these people were and why they were doing it. A clue can be found a few hundred yards from the stone circle at Stonehenge. Here stand several Neolithic burial sites, known as round barrows.
Well, here we are. This is King Barrow Ridge, and these are the King Barrow Mounds. And you can see they're absolutely enormous. And what is amazing is that underneath these great mounds, there's only one individual. And this person is buried on the land surface, and then they just piled up all this earth on top of them, and chalk, layers of chalk and earth.
Archaeologists have dated the graves at King Barrow Ridge to the time Stonehenge was built, about 4,000 years ago. But they've also found other graves here, called long barrows, from a much earlier period. They are very different from lavish burial places like King Barrow Ridge.
Towards the beginning, when you're talking about herds people at about 6,000 BC, they're burying their dead in long barrows. And often, not always, but often, these are communal barrows, and everyone seems to be being buried, or at least a cross-section. Children, women, men, all being buried there. And the question is there a very sharp change in the way in which the society is being structured?
By the time Stonehenge was built, an elite had emerged, one capable of ordering and organizing the building of the giant stone circle. Now, new evidence suggests sound might have been used to bolster their power, something perhaps demonstrated at the religious ceremonies archaeologists believe took place here. On such days, worshippers would approach Stonehenge by an ancient pathway known as the Avenue.
A really interesting aspect of the avenue is that its alignment actually follows the axes of the midsummer rising sun from the centre of the monument out into the landscape. And in the opposite direction, it's also the midwinter sunset. So people moving along the avenue and into the stone circle would have actually been following this cosmic axis, linking together two important days of the year. As we actually approach this enormous aperture, almost like a gateway giving access to the stone circle, suddenly then you would hear this noise coming from the centre that would have been largely distorted and blocked when you were standing outside the monument.
Perhaps the reason sound was blocked was to divide those on the inside of the stone circle from those on the outside.
The numbers of people who can actually be accommodated in the very central area, which is only really a few metres squared if you actually want to see the sun rising, the number of people who could stand there would almost certainly be very different to the number of people it would take even to move one of these stones. And if there are a group of people in here, only a limited number of them can really use this monument, it seems likely that there would have been others who, for whatever reason, would not have been permitted that kind of access. They would have remained outside.
Watson and Keating wanted to find out how sound may have been used during these religious ceremonies.
We set up the loudspeaker and the pink noise generator at the position of the altar stone, which is close to the centre of the sort of activities that would have happened at Stonehenge. And we noticed that as you walked around outside the outer circle in the best preserved part, that you could hear a rumble, the low frequencies from the pink noise all of the time. But as you came to the gaps in the outer stones, you got a better idea of what was going on. You heard a bit more of the high frequencies. But on the sides of Stonehenge, the large trilithons tend to block the view, both visually and acoustically. And so there were just these little snippets of sound. You could just hear it come through. Until finally, when you come onto the axis, which lines up with the midsummer sunrise, you've got a clear view through to the centre, and you can hear perfectly what's going on.
Thus, the acoustic properties of Stonehenge might reinforce the status of the priestly elite, the sort of people buried in the round barrows nearby. But Stonehenge was not the only place where sound might have been used in such a way. A discovery at the passage grave at Maes Howe suggests sound might also have been used to control people.
We found that at certain frequencies, the sound would suddenly become much fuller. It was as though instead of coming from the loudspeaker, it was coming from the whole chamber. And having found these frequencies, we then moved around the chamber of Maes Howe. And we found that not only was it loud, very uncomfortably loud in some places, but it was virtually silent in other places.
They had found standing waves, like John and Devereux discovered at New Grange. But standing waves not only amplify sound. As they bounce between the walls, they can also cancel each other out, so that in some parts of the room, no sound can be heard at all. The effects of standing waves at Maes Howe would have been easily observable and very dramatic.
As you move towards the antechambers, these are the little chambers off of the main chamber, the sound was getting louder. Now, immediately you sort of think, well, if you're someone in the Neolithic who's used to a sort of open-air existence, what would they think? They come into this structure, they may not even be aware that somebody is actually generating this sound. Even if they are aware they're making this sound, as they move towards them, it gets quieter. That would tell them, well, it's not coming from that person, is it? They move towards one of these antechambers, and the sound gets louder. So they will associate that sound with what's in the antechamber. And what's in the antechamber could be the rotting remains of one of their relatives. What do you think?
If the priests were exploiting sound in this way, then it might solve another mystery. Although New Grange, Maes Howe and Stonehenge are hundreds of miles apart, they all show similar acoustic properties. Was it possible their priests were somehow in touch with each other? A clue can be found in these Stone Age axe heads.
I think the most important thing about the axes is that they're usually found a long way from their geological sources. And very often they've moved into areas that have got perfectly good raw materials for making stone tools, and yet they're preferred. For example, the axes from the Central Lake District are very common on the Yorkshire Wolds, where there's a good flint supply.
In the Stone Age, axes might have had a religious or symbolic importance, and people would have traveled hundreds of miles to exchange them. And if goods could travel such distances, then so could ideas about sound.
If artifacts are moving long distances, it's likely that the ideas and concepts are moving with them. Some of the ideas that underlay structures like Maes Howe were being transmitted, carried across very large distances, across the sea to Ireland and across the mainland of the British Isles.
In Stone Age Britain, a priestly elite may have used sound to strengthen their influence. Today, new information from Ireland suggests just how far this use of sound could actually go. The Stone Age elite may have used sound as one method of maintaining their influence. At New Grange in Ireland, Archaeologists think the priests may have combined sound and light in a spectacular display of their power.
Once we had our sound generator working in the center of the chamber, obviously you've got sound waves radiating off in all directions, and one of those directions is back down the entrance passageway.
Newgrange was built so that it perfectly aligns with the winter solstice. Shortly after sunrise on the shortest day of the year, the sun's rays flood along the passage into the tomb, the only day this happens. Archaeologists believe such an event may have been marked with a ceremony held inside Newgrange.
There is a closing stone on the passageway, maybe at the winter solstice. This was moved back, and the priests carrying out their activities, their rituals in the chamber. We can imagine for the general population, the ordinary people perhaps gathered in a great assembly outside the entrance to Newgrange, there would be this great, deep, resonant sound coming out of the black entrance of the passageway, which would have an enormous impact on these people, like the gods, the ancestors, were actually speaking.
If on the winter solstice the sound properties of the passage were being exploited in such a way, it suggested one final possibility to Devereux. And it's the most radical possibility of all. If Stone Age people could use sound waves, could they actually see them too?
Throughout the whole chamber there's rock art, and when we're doing our work here we were particularly aware of this chevron zigzag pattern, and we noticed that the zigzags, the up and down pattern, was very, very similar to the form of waves that the sound takes on its way out down the entrance passage.
Devereux and his colleague, Bob Jahn, had already established the presence of standing waves at Newgrange, sound waves that bounced between the walls of the passage, amplifying or cancelling sound.
Basically, you can represent the pattern of standing sound waves in two ways. You can imagine yourself looking down on the cross-section of the entire structure, and as you look from the top in these cavities, I knew that those would look more or less like concentric circles that radiated out from the source of the sound out to the walls, and of course back again. And lo and behold, you look at the rock art on the walls of these facilities, and there are bullseye patterns that are more than suggestively similar to what the sound wave patterns that we were measuring were.
Standing waves can also be represented by looking sideways at them, plotting them into peaks of high sound and troughs of low sound. When Jahn and Devereux recorded the standing wave patterns along the passage, their graph showed 12 pairs of such peaks and troughs.
Same pattern appears on the interior walls in Newgrange and also outside in their curbstones, with precisely 12 sets of bumps in it.
Was this just a coincidence? Or was there some way in which the builders of Newgrange had actually seen sound waves? There was a clue. Archaeologists think that a ceremony would have been held inside Newgrange on the day of the winter solstice.
If we assume that there was a ritual going on inside the chamber, people were singing and chanting and carrying out their activities in there, it's quite feasible that they would have incense smoke, fumes of various kinds. And the sunbeam would shine through this, it would cut through this like a laser. And it's feasible, it's possible that the sound being produced in the ritual would the sound waves coming from it would become visible in the smoke.
Singing might cause the chamber to reverberate, creating standing waves of sound. These sound waves would cause incense and dust to rise, filling the tomb with a thick cloud. The sound waves would organize this cloud into areas of high and low density. when sunlight entered the passage, might it have illuminated these different areas, making the standing waves visible to the naked eye? Scientists at Princeton University have built a device to illustrate how this may have worked.
We have a cylindrical plastic pipe. We have put some very fine powder in it, which is now lying on the bottom. We turn on the sound generator. We sweep the frequency until we find the resonance, which we will identify audibly. And at that point, we will increase the intensity of the sound to the point that it actually will levitate the dust particles off of the floor of the channel, and they will accumulate in alternating places of high density and low density, and those patterns of high and low density are a visualization of where the standing waves are in this pipe. We are illuminating it, incidentally, from the other end, much as would have happened in the tunnel at Newgrange with the sunlight coming in one aperture. So what you're seeing here should look reasonably like what the ancients saw when the sunlight was illuminating their dust in their tunnel.
The science of acoustics has opened up new ways of looking at the Stone Age. Neolithic people built stone circles that amplified sound. They may have altered the structure of their tombs until they resonated to the human voice, and at Stonehenge even shaped the stones until they had the best acoustics for their religious ceremonies. Our ancestors may even have been able to see sound waves. Hundreds of years before the Great Pyramid in Egypt was built, it seems early Britons were designing their monuments with a sophisticated knowledge of sound.
More Secrets of the Dead next Monday at the same time, 9 o'clock. Details coming up. The book Stone Age Soundtracks is out now, priced $12.99. To order a copy, please call 0870 1234 344 or click on to channel4.com/shop. Next tonight, Bob Hoskins and Helen Mirren star in our British Gangster season presentation. Our Monday night film is The Long Good Friday.
For 160 million years, the dinosaurs